Imagine you're a small shop owner in a tough neighborhood. One day, a guy in an expensive suit walks in and says, "Nice place you got here. Would be a shame if something happened to it. For a small fee, I can make sure you're protected." That's a protection racket. It's also, in the most simplified terms, how America's role as the world's policeman works. Except instead of a neighborhood, it's the entire planet. Instead of a small fee, it's trillions of dollars. And instead of breaking your windows, the threat is economic collapse, trade route disruption, and geopolitical chaos. Welcome to the most expensive, most profitable protection scheme in human history. Since 1945, the United States has maintained military bases in over 80 countries. It has a navy larger than the next 13 navies combined. It spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. In 2024, the U.S. military budget was $886 billion. That's billion with a B. And here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. Why? Why does America spend nearly $1 trillion a year to be the world's policeman? Is it altruism? Is it spreading democracy and freedom? Or is it the most brilliant, most profitable business model ever created? Today, we're going to follow the money. We'll look at the petrodollar system, the reserve currency advantage, military-industrial profits, trade route control, and the massive economic benefits that come from being the guy with the biggest stick on the planet. This isn't a political analysis. This is a financial one. We're going to calculate whether being the world's cop is profitable or not. Spoiler alert, it's incredibly, absurdly, eye-wateringly profitable. Buckle up. We're about to see how America turned global security into the world's most lucrative franchise. 1. The petrodollar. How America turned oil into dollar printing. Let's start with the most brilliant financial move of the 20th century, the petrodollar system. In 1971, President Nixon did something that should have destroyed the dollar's value. He ended the gold standard. For decades, the dollar was backed by gold. You could theoretically exchange your dollars for actual gold at a fixed rate. That backing gave the dollar credibility. Nixon said, "Nope, we're done with that." He just ended it. Dollars were no longer backed by anything except trust in the U.S. government. This should have been catastrophic. Without gold backing, what stops the U.S. from just printing infinite money and causing hyperinflation? Enter the petrodollar. In 1974, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made a deal with Saudi Arabia. The deal was simple but world-changing. Saudi Arabia would sell oil only in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the U.S. would provide military protection and weapons to the Saudi regime. Think about what this means. Oil is the most traded commodity on Earth. Every country needs it. Cars, planes, ships, plastics, fertilizer, modern civilization runs on oil. And if you want to buy oil, you need dollars. Suddenly, every country in the world needs to hold massive reserves of U.S. dollars just to keep their economies running. If Japan wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they need dollars. If Germany wants oil, they need dollars. If China wants oil, they need dollars. This creates something economists call structural demand for the dollar. No matter what else happens, there will always be demand for dollars because there will always be demand for oil. And here's where it gets brilliant. The U.S. controls the supply of dollars. The Federal Reserve can print as many dollars as it wants. So the U.S. has created a system where the entire world needs dollars, and only the U.S. can create them. Let me put this in simpler terms. Imagine you're playing Monopoly, but you're the only one who can print Monopoly money. Everyone else has to earn it by going around the board, but you can just print more whenever you need it. That's the petrodollar system. By 2024, approximately 80% of global oil transactions are still conducted in U.S. dollars. That's trillions of dollars in global trade that must flow through the dollar system. This gives the U.S. enormous economic leverage, but the benefits go deeper. Because everyone needs dollars, everyone buys U.S. Treasury bonds. Treasury bonds are basically IOUs from the U.S. government. Countries buy them because they need a safe place to park their dollars, and U.S. government bonds are considered the safest investment in the world. This means the U.S. can borrow money at extremely low interest rates. In 2023, the U.S. had $33 trillion in national debt. For any other country, that would be a death sentence. But because of the petrodollar system, the U.S. can borrow that much and still pay lower interest rates than countries with far less debt. Why? Because the world needs dollars, so the world buys U.S. debt. The petrodollar system essentially allows the U.S. to export its inflation. When the Fed prints money, it doesn't just cause inflation in the U.S., it spreads that inflation across the entire global economy. But the U.S. gets to spend that newly printed money first, before inflation hits. It's like being first in line at a buffet that everyone else is paying for. How much is this worth? Conservative estimates put the exorbitant privilege of the dollar's reserve status at $100–150 billion per year in reduced borrowing costs alone. Some economists put it much higher when you factor in seigniorage, trade advantages, and financial sector dominance. And it all depends on the petrodollar, and the petrodollar depends on the U.S. military protecting oil producers and ensuring oil flows in dollars. The world's policeman role isn't charity, it's the enforcement mechanism for the world's most profitable currency scheme. 2. Reserve currency status, the money printing license. Let's zoom out from oil and look at the bigger picture, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. As of 2024, about 59% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in U.S. dollars. The euro is second at about 20%. The yen, pound, and yuan make up most of the rest. Being the reserve currency is like having a permanent hall pass to print money. Here's why. If you're Japan or Germany or Brazil and you print too much of your own currency, you get inflation. Your currency loses value. Your economy suffers. You face a crisis. But if you're the United States and you print more dollars, the entire world absorbs that inflation because the entire world holds dollars. You can print trillions of dollars, which the U.S. did during COVID, and while it causes some inflation, it doesn't destroy the currency because demand for dollars is global. During the 2020 pandemic, the Federal Reserve printed about $3 trillion in a few months. For any other country, that would have caused hyperinflation and economic collapse. What happened to the dollar? It barely budged. There was inflation in 2021-2023, yes, but compared to what should have happened if the U.S. weren't the reserve currency, it was mild. Why? Because that $3 trillion got spread across the entire global economy. China absorbed some of it, Europe absorbed some, Japan, Korea, Brazil, everyone holding dollars absorbed some of that inflation. The U.S. essentially taxed the entire world to pay for its pandemic response, and it could do this because of reserve currency status. And reserve currency status exists because of military dominance. Let me give you a specific example of how this works. In 2008, during the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve set up dollar swap lines with foreign central banks. Basically, the Fed agreed to provide unlimited dollars to foreign central banks in exchange for their local currency. Why did foreign central banks desperately need dollars? Because global finance runs on dollars. Companies worldwide had borrowed in dollars. International trade happens in dollars. When credit markets froze, everyone needed dollars immediately. The Fed could provide those dollars because it can create them out of thin air. No other central bank has this power at the global level. The European Central Bank can print euros, but most of the world doesn't need euros. The People's Bank of China can print yuan, but most of the world doesn't need yuan. Only the Fed can print the currency the world needs. This gives the U.S. extraordinary power in times of crisis, and it's worth real money. Economists estimate that reserve currency status saves the U.S. about 0.5% on borrowing costs. That might not sound like much, but applied to $33 trillion in debt, it's $100–165 billion per year in saved interest payments. That's more than the GDP of Ukraine every year, just in interest savings. But the benefits go beyond interest rates. Reserve currency status means U.S. financial institutions dominate global finance. The largest banks, asset managers, and insurance companies are American. Wall Street is the center of global capital markets. Companies worldwide list on U.S. stock exchanges. The dollar is the currency of choice for international contracts, even between countries that aren't the U.S. All of this generates enormous revenue for the U.S. financial sector. In 2023, the U.S. financial sector contributed $5.2 trillion to GDP, about 20% of the entire economy. That sector exists in its current dominant form because of the dollar's reserve status. And the dollar's reserve status exists because the U.S. military makes sure the global economic system keeps running and keeps running on dollars. 3. Military bases as economic outposts. The U.S. has approximately 750 military bases in at least 80 countries. This is more than all other countries combined. Most people think of military bases as defense installations. They are, but they're also economic infrastructure. Let's take one example, Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Ramstein is the largest U.S. Air Force base outside America. It hosts about 9,200 active duty personnel and their families. But the economic impact goes far beyond military salaries. The base pumps about $1.3 billion annually into the local German economy through personnel spending on local goods and services, base procurement of local supplies, construction and maintenance contracts, rental payments to German landlords, local employment of German civilians on base. For the local region, Ramstein is an economic engine. German businesses depend on it. German politicians want it to stay. Now multiply that by 750 bases worldwide. But the economic benefit to the U.S. is more subtle and more valuable than direct spending. These bases give the U.S. 1. Intelligence-gathering capabilities that benefit U.S. companies. 2. Logistical infrastructure that reduces costs for U.S. military operations. 3. Political leverage that translates into favorable trade terms. 4. Forward positioning that protects U.S. economic interests globally. Let's focus on that last point with a specific example. In 2023, about 21% of global oil production passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, about 21 million barrels per day. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, ensures that strait stays open. If that strait closed, global oil prices would skyrocket. The global economy would face crisis. Who benefits most from that strait staying open? Everyone who uses oil. But especially the U.S., which depends on stable oil prices for economic growth, needs global trade to continue for its export industries, benefits from the dollar's petrodollar status, which requires oil to keep flowing. The Fifth Fleet in Bahrain costs the U.S. taxpayer money, but it generates far more value by ensuring global trade continues smoothly. And here's the kicker. Other countries don't have to spend money maintaining that protection. Germany doesn't need to send its navy to the Persian Gulf because the U.S. Navy is already there. Japan doesn't need to protect oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz because the U.S. already does it. This means other developed countries can spend less on their militaries and more on their economies. The U.S. spends 3.5% of GDP on defense. Germany spends 1.5%. Japan spends 1.1%. The flip side is that this gives the U.S. enormous leverage. When the U.S. says we need favorable trade terms, or we need you to buy our weapon systems, or we need you to support our foreign policy, it's hard for those countries to say no, because ultimately they depend on the U.S. military to keep global trade flowing. 4. The military-industrial complex. As economic engine, President Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex in 1961. He was right to warn. But what he described wasn't just a danger, it's also an incredibly profitable business model. The U.S. defense industry is enormous. In 2023, the top 5 U.S. defense contractors alone had combined revenues of over $220 billion, Lockheed Martin, $67 billion, Raytheon Technologies, $67 billion, Boeing Defense, $33 billion, Northrop Grumman, $39 billion, General Dynamics, $43 billion. These companies employ over 1 million Americans directly and support millions more jobs in their supply chains. But here's where it gets interesting from a world's policeman perspective. Being the world's policeman means the U.S. military is constantly engaged somewhere. That means constant demand for weapons systems, ammunition, replacement parts, upgrades and maintenance, new technology development. This creates steady, predictable revenue for defense contractors. Unlike most industries that face boom-bust cycles, defense contractors have a customer, the U.S. government, that never goes away and always has money. But the profit isn't just domestic. The U.S. is also the world's largest arms exporter by far. In 2022, the U.S. accounted for 40% of global arms exports. Who's buying American weapons? Countries that are part of the U.S. security umbrella. Countries that depend on the U.S. military for protection but also want their own defensive capabilities. Here's the genius of the model. The U.S. provides security, which makes countries dependent on the U.S. Then the U.S. sells weapons to those countries, generating profit. Those weapons require U.S. training, U.S. maintenance, U.S. spare parts, creating long-term revenue streams. And because those countries use U.S. weapon systems, they become interoperable with the U.S. military. They can't easily switch to Russian or Chinese weapons because their entire military infrastructure is built around American systems. This is called vendor lock-in in the business world. Once a customer commits to your ecosystem, switching costs become prohibitive, so they keep buying from you. In 2023, U.S. foreign military sales exceeded $80 billion. That's $80 billion in defense exports, which supports American jobs, American companies, and American technological superiority. And it all flows from being the world's policeman. If the U.S. withdrew from global security, why would countries keep buying American weapons? 5. Control of global trade routes. About 90% of global trade by volume travels by sea. That's $14 trillion worth of goods moving on ships across oceans every year. The U.S. Navy ensures those trade routes stay open and safe. This has been true since World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant naval power. The benefit of this is enormous, but it's subtle. It's not a line item in the budget that says trade route control profit, $X billion. Instead, it shows up in the smooth functioning of the entire global economy. Let me give you a concrete example. In the early 2000s, Somali pirates started attacking ships in the Gulf of Aden, a critical waterway between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. About 10% of global oil passes through this route. Insurance costs for ships transiting the area skyrocketed. Some shipping companies started routing around Africa, adding thousands of miles and enormous cost to deliveries. The U.S. Navy, along with international partners, launched anti-piracy operations. Piracy rates dropped dramatically. Insurance costs normalized. Trade continued efficiently. Who benefited? Everyone involved in global trade. But especially U.S. companies importing goods, lower shipping costs, U.S. companies exporting goods, access to markets, U.S. consumers, lower prices on imports. The dollar system, trade continuing in dollars. The cost of those anti-piracy operations was maybe a few $100 million per year. The benefit to global trade was billions. And here's the crucial part. The U.S. gets to decide which trade routes to protect and which to let deteriorate. If you're a country that depends on trade and you're on good terms with the U.S., your shipping routes are protected by the most powerful navy in history at no cost to you. If you're a country that challenges U.S. interests, you might find your trade routes suddenly less secure. This isn't hypothetical. When Iran threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. response is immediate. We will keep it open. When Russia threatens European energy security, the U.S. steps in. When China threatens Taiwan, the U.S. makes clear that would disrupt trade routes the U.S. protects. The power to control global trade routes is the power to control the global economy, and the U.S. has that power. What's it worth? Some estimates suggest that the U.S. gains about $270 billion per year in trade benefits from maintaining global maritime security. That's compared to a U.S. Navy budget of about $230 billion. In other words, the Navy pays for itself just from trade benefits, not even counting all the other advantages. 6. Financial sanctions as economic weapon. Here's a power that gets less attention but is absolutely crucial: the U.S. ability to impose financial sanctions that actually work. Why can the U.S. impose sanctions that cripple entire economies? Because of the dollar's dominance in the global financial system. Let me explain how this works. When the U.S. imposes sanctions on a country, what it's really doing is cutting that country off from the dollar-based financial system. This means foreign banks can't process dollar transactions with that country. International trade becomes difficult or impossible. Access to global capital markets is blocked. Foreign investment stops. Why does this matter so much? Because most international trade and finance happens in dollars. Even trade between two non-U.S. countries often uses dollars as the intermediary currency. If you're cut off from the dollar system, you're cut off from most of the global economy. Examples. When the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran, Iran's oil exports dropped from 2.5 million barrels per day to under 500,000. Not because the U.S. military blocked shipments, but because no one wanted to risk being cut off from the dollar system by trading with Iran. When the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion, Russia lost access to about $300 billion in foreign exchange reserves that were held in dollars or in Western banks. Overnight, gone. Russia's economy contracted, the ruble crashed, import prices skyrocketed, all without a single shot fired. This is economic warfare, and it only works because the U.S. is the world's policeman and the dollar is the world's currency. If the U.S. were just another country, sanctions would be meaningless. If the dollar weren't the reserve currency, countries could just use other currencies and ignore U.S. sanctions. But because of the military-backed dollar system, U.S. financial sanctions have teeth. What's this power worth? It's hard to quantify, but consider. Sanctions allow the U.S. to achieve foreign policy goals without military action. They're a tool for enforcing U.S. interests globally at minimal cost. When the U.S. says follow these rules or face sanctions, countries often comply, because the alternative, being cut off from the dollar system, is economically catastrophic. This is soft power backed by the hard power of military dominance, and it translates into economic leverage that benefits U.S. interests across the board. 7. Technology and innovation dominance. Being the world's policeman requires cutting-edge technology. The U.S. military drives innovation in aerospace, computing, communications, materials, science, energy, artificial intelligence. This military R&D often leads to commercial applications that benefit the U.S. economy far beyond defense. Examples: the Internet started as ARPANET, a Defense Department project. GPS was developed by the U.S. military. Countless computer technologies trace back to military research. In 2023, the U.S. defense budget included about $140 billion for research and development. That's $140 billion in taxpayer-funded innovation that often spins off into commercial products. Companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and Raytheon develop military technology with government funding, then commercialize variants for civilian use. The government pays for the R&D risk, the companies reap the commercial rewards. But there's a deeper benefit. To maintain military dominance, the U.S. needs to stay ahead technologically. This drives investment in STEM education, research universities, and high-tech industries. The result? The U.S. has the most advanced tech sector in the world. 7 of the 10 largest tech companies globally are American. U.S. tech sector market cap, over $12 trillion. Silicon Valley alone has GDP comparable to most countries. Did the military create Silicon Valley? Not directly. But the ecosystem of defense spending, university research, venture capital, and technological innovation all interconnect. Being the world's policeman requires being the world's technology leader, and being the technology leader generates enormous economic value. 8. The cost-benefit analysis. Okay, let's talk numbers. Is being the world's policeman actually profitable? The costs. Defense budget, 2024, $886 billion. Veterans benefits, $325 billion. Intelligence agencies, $90 billion. Estimated foreign aid, often tied to military goals, $50 billion. Total, about $1.35 trillion per year. That's a lot of money. About 5% of U.S. GDP. Now the benefits: interest savings from reserve currency status, $150 billion year trade. Benefits from protected routes, $270 billion year. Petrodollar system advantages, $100 billion plus the dollars year. Estimated defense industry exports, $86 billion year. Technology spillover economic value, hard to quantify but easily $100+ billion year. Financial leverage from sanctions and dollar dominance, impossible to quantify but enormous. Reduced need for allies to spend on defense, allowing more favorable trade terms, $50+ billion year. Even being conservative, the direct economic benefits are probably $700+ billion per year. When you add indirect benefits, trade advantages, favorable terms, prevented crises, technological dominance, the number is likely higher than the cost. But here's what's really important. These benefits compound over time. Reserve currency status builds on itself. The more the world uses dollars, the more entrenched the system becomes. Military bases established in the 1950s still provide value today, 70 years later. The Petrodollar system, established in 1974, has been generating benefits for 50 years. The technology dominance from military R&D creates advantages for decades. This isn't just an annual cost benefit. It's an investment that pays dividends indefinitely. 9. The alternatives. What would happen if the U.S. stopped being the world's policeman? Some argue the U.S. would save money, cut the military budget in half, bring troops home, focus on domestic issues. But let's think through the economic consequences. 1. Dollar loses reserve currency status. Borrowing costs increase by $150 billion year. U.S. debt becomes unsustainable. Economic crisis. 2. Petrodollar system collapses. Oil trades in multiple currencies. Dollar demand drops. Inflation. Economic crisis. 3. Global trade routes become unstable. Trade costs increase. U.S. imports become expensive. Standard of living drops. Economic crisis. 4. U.S. loses leverage over trade partners. less favorable trade terms, trade deficit worsens, job losses, economic crisis. 5. Defense industry collapses, million-plus jobs lost, high-tech manufacturing destroyed, technological decline. The economic structure of the United States is built on being the world's policeman. The entire system, the dollar, the trade relationships, the financial sector, the tech advantage depends on U.S. military dominance. You can't just stop without catastrophic consequences. It's like asking, what if we stopped maintaining the interstate highway system? Think of the money we'd save. Sure, you'd save money on maintenance, but the economic cost of not having those highways would be devastating. Being the world's policeman is the infrastructure of U.S. economic dominance. 10. Final thoughts. The business of security. So here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to say out loud. America isn't the world's policeman out of altruism. It's not about spreading democracy or protecting freedom or defending human rights, though those might be nice side benefits. America is the world's policeman because it's extraordinarily profitable. The military isn't a cost center. It's an investment that generates returns far exceeding its expense. Every dollar spent on the Navy protecting trade routes generates multiple dollars in trade benefits. Every dollar spent maintaining the dollar's reserve status saves multiple dollars in borrowing costs. Every dollar spent on military bases abroad generates multiple dollars in economic leverage and favorable trade terms. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. The system was designed this way. After World War II, American policymakers made a calculated decision: use military dominance to create an economic system that benefits the United States above all others. They succeeded brilliantly. Is it fair? Probably not. Does it exploit developing countries? Arguably, yes. Is it sustainable forever? Probably not. But it's been incredibly, absurdly, world-dominatingly profitable for 80 years. The question isn't whether America can afford to be the world's policeman. The question is whether America can afford not to be. Because at this point, the entire U.S. economic model depends on it. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand how economics actually runs the world, hit that subscribe button. Next video, how China is trying to break the petrodollar system and whether they can actually succeed. It's the sequel to this story. Drop a comment. Do you think the U.S. should continue as the world's policeman, or is it time to hand over the badge? I read everyone. And if this changed how you think about military spending, smash that like button. Because understanding the economics of empire is the first step to understanding how the modern world actually works. See you in the next one. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe start paying attention to whose currency your country uses to buy oil.